She was 32 and desperate enough to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride in a town that didn't exist on any decent map. But when Margaret Fielding stepped off that dusty stagecoach, she found something she never expected: a widowed rancher too proud to admit he needed help, and two boys who'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to choose them back. Margaret's hands shook as she gripped the worn leather handle of her carpetbag, watching the other women climb down from the stagecoach with the confidence of youth and beauty. Sarah couldn't be more than 19, her golden hair catching the late afternoon sun like spun silk. Emma was perhaps 22, with the kind of delicate features that made men stumble over their own boots. And then there was Margaret, 32 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, calloused hands that spoke of hard work, and a face that had seen too much disappointment to believe in fairy tales anymore. The men of Clearwater Ridge stood in an awkward semicircle near the general store, hats in their hands and hope written across their weathered faces. Margaret recognized the type immediately: ranchers and farmers who'd been working their land alone for too long, who needed wives more for survival than romance. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the way their eyes slid past her as if she were invisible, settling instead on Sarah's bright smile and Emma's soft curves. "Miss Sarah Patterson," called out a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. Sarah stepped forward with a graceful curtsy, and Margaret watched the relief flood the man's face as if he'd won some kind of lottery. "Miss Emma Collins," came the next call, and Emma glided toward a younger rancher whose grin could have powered the town's single street lamp. Margaret stood alone beside the stagecoach, her stomach twisting with a familiar ache of rejection. The remaining men shuffled their feet and glanced at each other, clearly hoping someone else would step forward first. She'd been through this before, not with mail-order bride arrangements, but with life. Always the sensible choice, never the desired one. Always reliable Margaret, practical Margaret, too old Margaret, who was good enough to help raise her sister's children but not good enough to have her own family. The silence stretched until it became painful, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She was just turning toward the stagecoach driver to ask about return passage when a small voice cut through the awkwardness like a knife through butter. "Pa, that one. That's our new ma." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. A boy of perhaps 8 years old stood at the edge of the crowd, one thin arm pointing directly at Margaret. His clothes were clean but patched, his dark hair stuck up in rebellious cowlicks, and his brown eyes held a seriousness that didn't belong on such a young face. Beside him stood a smaller boy, maybe 5, clutching a wooden horse and staring at Margaret with the kind of intensity that made her heart skip. "Tommy, what did I tell you about?" The voice belonged to a man stepping out from behind the crowd, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and hands that looked strong enough to build worlds or gentle enough to comfort nightmares. But it was his eyes that stopped her, cold, blue as a winter sky, and filled with exhaustion, grief, and something that might have been panic. "You said we were here to meet our new ma," Tommy said with the devastating logic of childhood. "Well, there she is. She looks like she knows how to make real biscuits, not the burned ones you make. And she's got nice eyes. Mama always said nice eyes were important." The silence that followed could have choked a horse. Margaret watched as the man's face cycled through horror, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't quite name. The other prospective brides looked on with expressions ranging from pity to amusement, while the remaining bachelors seemed torn between relief at being off the hook and disappointment that their options had just narrowed considerably. "I'm sorry, miss," the man said, his voice rough with mortification. "The boys, they don't understand how this works. I'm Caleb Morrison, and these are my sons, Tommy and little Jake. We weren't." He trailed off, clearly drowning in his own awkwardness. But Margaret was looking at the boys, really looking at them. Tommy's chin was raised with stubborn determination, but she could see the vulnerability underneath, the desperate hope of a child who'd been disappointed too many times. Jake hadn't said a word, but his small hand had found its way into his brother's, and his dark eyes never left Margaret's face, as if he were trying to memorize her features before she disappeared like everyone else had. Something cracked open in Margaret's chest, something that had been locked away for years. These weren't just motherless boys looking for someone to cook their meals and mend their clothes. These were children who'd learned to hope carefully, who'd probably watched their father struggle alone while pretending everything was fine. They were choosing her not because she was the only option left, but because something in her face had spoken to something in their hearts. "Well," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I do make excellent biscuits, and I happen to think nice eyes are important too." She took a step toward them, ignoring the way the crowd seemed to lean forward in anticipation. "What I'd like to know is whether you boys are prepared to help with the chores, because I don't believe in lazy children." Tommy's face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire territory. "Yes, ma'am. We're real good helpers, aren't we, Jake?" The smaller boy nodded solemnly, still clutching his wooden horse but taking a tiny step closer to Margaret. Caleb Morrison looked like a man who'd been thrown from his horse and wasn't sure which way was up. "Miss, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand the situation. I'm not looking for a wife. I mean, I wasn't planning. The boys, they get ideas sometimes." "Mr. Morrison," Margaret interrupted, surprised by the firmness in her own voice, "perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. I believe we have some things to discuss." She glanced meaningfully at the crowd of onlookers, who were hanging on every word like it was the most entertaining show they'd seen all year. Caleb's jaw worked for a moment, and Margaret could practically see the war going on behind his eyes. Duty warring with desire, practicality battling with something deeper and more dangerous. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Boys, collect Miss Fielding, Margaret Fielding. Miss Fielding's bag. We'll talk at the house." His voice was carefully neutral, but Margaret caught the way his eyes lingered on her face for just a moment too long, and she felt something flutter in her chest that she'd thought was long dead. As they walked away from the crowd, Tommy chattering excitedly about all the things their new ma would do with them while Jake maintained his serious silence, Margaret couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, someone had chosen her first, not because she was convenient or available or the best of limited options, but because a child had looked at her and seen exactly what he needed. The real question was whether Caleb Morrison would see the same thing, or whether this fragile hope would shatter before it had a chance to take root. The Morrison ranch house sat like a lonely island in an ocean of golden grass, its weathered wood and sagging porch telling the story of a man trying to hold everything together with determination alone. Margaret followed Caleb up the front steps, acutely aware of Tommy's excited chatter and Jake's silent scrutiny, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Inside, the house spoke of recent loss in ways that broke Margaret's heart. A woman's touch lingered in the faded curtains and carefully arranged wildflowers that had long since dried to dust, but masculine practicality had taken over everywhere else. Dishes were stacked with military precision, clothes hung on pegs with no thought to comfort, and the whole place felt like a man's awkward attempt to fill a woman-shaped hole in his family's life. "Sit," Caleb said, gesturing toward the kitchen table with the stiff formality of a man who'd forgotten how to have guests. "Boys, go wash your hands. Miss Fielding and I need to talk." Tommy opened his mouth to protest, but something in his father's tone made him grab Jake's hand and disappear toward the back of the house. Margaret settled into one of the mismatched chairs, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. She'd been rejected before, but never after someone had chosen her so publicly, so completely. The thought of disappointing those two little boys made her stomach twist with something close to physical pain. Caleb remained standing, his broad shoulders tense as he stared out the kitchen window toward the barn. "Miss Fielding, I need you to understand something. My boys, they've been through enough disappointment to last several lifetimes. Their mother died 2 years ago in childbirth, along with the baby we thought would complete our family. Since then, they've gotten attached to every woman who's shown them the slightest kindness. The schoolteacher who moved back east, the preacher's daughter who married the blacksmith, the widow Thompson who decided she needed a fresh start in California. Margaret's heart clenched at the pain in his voice, but she forced herself to stay silent, sensing he needed to say this. Each time, they convince themselves that this woman is going to stay, going to become their new mother, going to fill the hole that Emma left behind. And each time, they're crushed when reality sets in. I can't watch them go through that again, especially not with someone who came here expecting to marry a different man entirely. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said quietly, "who says I was expecting to marry anyone at all?" He turned from the window, his blue eyes sharp with surprise. "You answered an advertisement for mail-order brides. What else would you be expecting?" Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, though it held more sadness than humor. "I expected exactly what happened out there. To be passed over for younger, prettier women while I stood there like yesterday's bread waiting for someone desperate enough to settle for what nobody else wanted. I've been settling my whole life, Mr. Morrison. I'm tired of it." The honesty in her own voice surprised her. She'd never admitted that to anyone, barely admitted it to herself. But something about this man's raw grief and his son's fierce hope had stripped away her usual careful pretenses. Caleb's expression shifted, confusion replacing certainty. "Then why did you come all this way?" "Because I'm 32 years old and I've spent the last 15 years raising my sister's children while she lived her life, and taking care of my parents until they died, and working as a seamstress for women who pitied me for being a spinster while paying me barely enough to survive. Because I'm tired of being useful instead of wanted, tired of being grateful for scraps when what I really want is a chance to love someone who might love me back." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her boldness, but she couldn't take them back now, wouldn't take them back. "When Tommy pointed at me and said I was their new mother, it was the first time in my life that someone chose me first. Not because I was convenient or available or the best of bad options, but because he looked at me and saw something he needed. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Caleb's throat worked as he swallowed hard, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw something raw and vulnerable flicker across his features. "Miss Fielding." "Margaret, and before you tell me why this is impossible, let me tell you what I see when I look at your boys. I see Tommy trying so hard to be brave that he's forgotten how to be 8 years old. I see Jake who's so afraid of losing someone else that he barely speaks above a whisper. I see 2 children who need more than someone to cook their meals and wash their clothes. They need someone who won't leave." "You don't know anything about us," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know that Tommy's shirt has a patch on the elbow that was sewn by someone who cared more about function than form, which means you did it yourself. I know that Jake carries that wooden horse everywhere, which tells me it probably belonged to his mother and he's afraid if he puts it down, he'll lose her memory too. I know that this house feels like a family holding its breath, waiting for permission to live again." The sound of running footsteps announced the boys' return before Caleb could respond. Tommy burst into the kitchen with Jake close behind, both of them looking expectantly between their father and Margaret as if they could will a happy ending into existence through sheer determination. "Did you tell her about the baby chickens, Pa?" Tommy asked eagerly. "And how Jake's real good with the horses even though he's little? And how we help with everything and we don't cry when we get hurt?" Margaret's heart squeezed at the desperate hope in the boy's voice, the way he was listing their qualifications like a man applying for a job he couldn't afford to lose. Jake said nothing, but his dark eyes never left Margaret's face, and she could see him holding his breath. "Boys," Caleb said gently, "Miss Fielding has her own life to think about. She can't just—" "Actually," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself again, "I was wondering if you might need help around here for a while. just temporarily until you can make other arrangements. I have nowhere else to be, and it seems like you could use an extra pair of hands." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning, while Jake took a small step closer to Margaret's chair. Caleb looked like a man watching a runaway horse head straight for a cliff, knowing he should stop it but paralyzed by the certainty that any sudden movement would make everything worse. "I can't pay you much," he said finally, his voice rough. "I don't need much. Just room and board and the chance to be useful to people who might actually appreciate it. It wouldn't be proper, a single woman living here with." "Mr. Morrison, I'm 32 years old and past the age where anyone cares about my reputation. Besides, I'd hardly be the first housekeeper to live under the same roof as her employer." Margaret could see him wavering, caught between practical need and stubborn pride. She pressed her advantage, leaning forward slightly. "1 month. Give me 1 month to prove that I'm not going anywhere, that I won't break your boys' hearts or complicate your life beyond repair. If at the end of that time you want me to leave, I'll go quietly and no questions asked." Tommy grabbed his father's arm, his small hands desperate. "Please, Pa, just 1 month. We'll be real good, won't we, Jake?" The smaller boy nodded solemnly, his wooden horse clutched tight against his chest. Caleb Morrison looked down at his son's pleading faces, then back at Margaret, and she saw the exact moment when his resistance crumbled. "1 month," he said quietly. "But I want it understood that this is a temporary arrangement. You'll have your own room, you'll be paid fair wages for fair work, and when the month is up, you'll be free to make whatever choice seems best." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Tommy let out a whoop of joy that could have been heard in the next county, while Jake's serious little face broke into the first smile she'd seen from him. It was like watching the sun come out after a long, hard winter. "Well then," Margaret said, standing and smoothing her skirts, "I suppose I should see about making those biscuits Tommy mentioned, and perhaps someone could show me where I'll be sleeping." As the boys raced to lead her on a tour of the house, chattering excitedly about all the things they wanted to show their new ma, Margaret caught Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was wariness there, and something that might have been fear, but underneath it all was a flicker of hope so fragile it made her chest tight. 1 month, 30 days to prove that some things were worth the risk of believing in again. 3 weeks into her month at the Morrison Ranch, Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of Jake screaming. She threw on her robe and raced down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floors, her heart hammering with the kind of terror that could only come from hearing a child in distress. She reached his bedroom just as Caleb burst through the door from the other direction, his hair wild and his eyes wide with panic. Jake was sitting up in his small bed, his wooden horse clutched so tightly to his chest that his knuckles had gone white. Tears streamed down his face as he sobbed with the devastating heartbreak of a 5-year-old who just watched his worst nightmare come true in his dreams. Tommy was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, and rubbing his little brother's back with the practiced comfort of someone who'd done this too many times before. "She left Pa," Tommy whispered, his own voice thick with tears. "In his dream, she left just like all the others, just like Mama." Margaret felt something crack in her chest as she watched Caleb's face cycle through helplessness, grief, and a fury directed entirely at himself. This was what he'd been afraid of, what he'd tried to protect his boys from by keeping his distance from her, by treating her like hired help instead of family. But 3 weeks of shared meals and bedtime stories and gentle teasing had already woven her so deeply into their lives that Jake's subconscious had recognized the truth that the adults were still dancing around. Without thinking, Margaret crossed to the bed and sat down on Jake's other side, reaching out to smooth his dark hair away from his tear-stained face. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." "You promise?" Jake hiccuped, his dark eyes searching her face with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been lied to before. You promise you won't leave like Mama did." The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. How could she promise something like that when her month was almost up, when Caleb had made it clear that their arrangement was temporary, when she herself didn't know what would happen when the sun rose on the 30th day? But looking into Jake's terrified eyes, feeling the way his small body shook with suppressed sobs, she knew there was only one answer she could give. "I promise," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I promise I will never, ever leave you boys." Jake threw himself into her arms with the fierce desperation of a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. Margaret held him close, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair, while her heart broke for all the loss this little boy had already endured. Over his head, she met Caleb's eyes and saw her own determination reflected back at her, along with something deeper and more dangerous that made her pulse skip. "Tommy, why don't you stay with Jake for a few minutes while your father and I talk?" Margaret said gently. Tommy nodded solemnly, crawling under the covers to curl up next to his brother like a human shield against the dark. Margaret rose slowly, every instinct screaming at her to stay and comfort the boys, but knowing that this conversation couldn't wait another minute. Caleb followed her out into the hallway, closing Jake's door quietly behind them. In the dim light filtering through the window at the end of the hall, he looked haggard and older than his years, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. They stood there for a moment in silence, both of them acutely aware that everything had just changed, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained for 3 weeks had just been obliterated by a 5-year-old's nightmare. "You can't promise him things like that," Caleb said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. "You can't promise to stay when you don't know what the future holds." "Can't I?" Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "Caleb, look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem like someone who makes promises lightly?" He did look at her then, his blue eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Margaret was suddenly aware that she was standing in a hallway in her nightgown and robe, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders, more vulnerable and exposed than she'd been in years. But she didn't step back, didn't try to cover herself or retreat to the safety of her room. This moment felt too important, too fragile to interrupt with modesty. "3 weeks ago, you were ready to put me on the next stagecoach out of town," she continued. "What's changed?" Caleb's jaw worked as he struggled with words that didn't want to come. "You," he said finally. "You've changed everything. The way Tommy laughs at your stories, the way Jake actually talks when you're around, the way this house feels like a home again instead of just a place where we sleep and eat. The way I catch myself looking forward to coming in from the fields just to see you smile." Margaret's heart stuttered at the raw honesty in his voice. "And that terrifies you?" "It terrifies me because I can't lose anyone else, and I can't watch my boys lose anyone else. Emma's death nearly destroyed us all, and we're just starting to heal. If you leave—" "I'm not Emma," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not going to die in childbirth or get sick or disappear in the night. I'm a healthy, stubborn woman who's tired of running from the life she wants. I'm tired of being careful, Caleb. I'm tired of protecting myself from disappointment by never hoping for anything better." She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the conflict warring in his eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of soap and honest sweat that she'd come to associate with safety and home. "I made that little boy a promise, and I intend to keep it. The question is whether you're brave enough to let me." Caleb's breath hitched, and for a moment Margaret thought he might reach for her, might close the distance between them and turn this fragile understanding into something deeper and more dangerous. Instead, he stepped back, running his hands through his hair with the frustrated motion of a man at war with himself. "Margaret, you don't understand what you're asking. This isn't some romantic fairy tale where love conquers all and everyone lives happily ever after. This is real life, with real consequences. I'm a widowed rancher with 2 grieving boys and more debt than I like to think about. I can barely keep this place running as it is, and I sure as hell can't offer you the kind of life you deserve." "And what kind of life do I deserve?" Margaret asked, surprised by the edge in her own voice. "The kind where I spend my remaining years alone in some boarding house, sewing other women's wedding dresses while dreaming about what might have been. The kind where I die forgotten and unmourned because I was too afraid to take a chance on happiness." She saw him flinch at her words, saw the moment when her arrow found its mark. Because he understood, didn't he? He understood what it felt like to be afraid of hope, to protect yourself from loss by refusing to love anything worth losing. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," Margaret continued, her voice gentler now. "I'm not asking for promises you're not ready to make or declarations of love you don't feel. I'm asking for honesty. I'm asking you to admit that what's been building between us these past 3 weeks is real, and that it's worth exploring instead of running from." The sound of Jake's door opening interrupted whatever Caleb might have said. Tommy's tousled head appeared in the doorway, his young face creased with worry. "Pa, is Miss Margaret really staying? Because Jake won't go back to sleep until he knows for sure." Margaret and Caleb looked at each other across the narrow hallway, both of them aware that this moment would define everything that came after. She could see the fear in his eyes, but she could also see something else, a desperate longing that matched her own, a hunger for connection that 3 weeks of careful distance hadn't been able to kill. "Yes," Caleb said quietly, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "Miss Margaret is staying." Tommy's face broke into a grin bright enough to light up the entire territory. "I'll tell Jake." He disappeared back into the bedroom, and they could hear his excited whisper carrying the news to his little brother. "Caleb," Margaret began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't say anything else tonight. Just let me figure out how to be brave enough for this. Let me figure out how to believe that some things might actually last." Margaret nodded, her throat too tight for words. She watched him disappear into his own room, leaving her standing alone in the hallway with her heart racing and her future suddenly, impossibly bright with possibility. From Jake's room came the sound of soft, sleepy chatter as Tommy told his brother about all the things they would do now that Miss Margaret was staying forever. And for the first time in her life, Margaret allowed herself to believe that forever might actually be within reach. But as she made her way back to her own room, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was still balanced on a knife's edge, that one wrong move could still send everything tumbling down. She'd won this battle, but the war for their hearts, and for the right to call this place home, was far from over. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, with Margaret humming while she packed lunch for Caleb and the boys, Jake chattering about the baby calf he'd helped deliver, and Tommy practicing his reading at the kitchen table. 4 weeks had passed since that night in the hallway, 4 weeks of careful courtship disguised as daily life, of stolen glances and accidentally brushing hands, of Caleb finding excuses to linger in the kitchen while Margaret cooked and Margaret finding reasons to walk out to the fields where he worked shirtless in the afternoon sun. They hadn't talked about the future again, both of them seemingly content to exist in this bubble of domestic happiness where tomorrow was always another day away. Margaret had moved into the house completely, her few possessions scattered throughout the rooms like seeds taking root. Her book sat next to Caleb's on the shelf, her sewing basket claimed a corner of the parlor, and her lavender soap scented the air with promises of permanence. The boys had bloomed under her attention like flowers after rain. Tommy had started bringing her wildflowers every few days, presenting them with the serious ceremony of a suitor courting his beloved. Jake had begun talking in full sentences instead of whispered fragments, and just last week he'd fallen asleep in her lap while she read to him, his wooden horse finally abandoned on the floor in favor of her warm embrace. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, listening to the boys' laughter as they played with their new puppy, when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon that meant a rider approaching fast. Her hands stilled on the wet sheet she was pinning up, some primitive instinct warning her that whatever news this rider brought, it wouldn't be good. Caleb emerged from the barn, squinting toward the approaching horse with the same wariness Margaret felt. The rider was young, probably not more than 16, and his face was flushed with excitement and the importance of his mission. He pulled up in front of the house in a cloud of dust, his horse dancing and snorting from the hard ride. "Mr. Morrison, I've got a telegram for you, sir. Came in this morning from back east." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. Telegrams never brought good news, especially telegrams that required a hard ride to deliver. She watched Caleb take the yellow paper with hands that weren't quite steady, watched his face change as he read the words that would shatter their fragile happiness. "What is it?" Margaret asked, though part of her already understood why Caleb's face had gone pale as winter snow. "It's Emma's sister, Caroline," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "She's coming to claim the boys." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Emma's sister, the one who'd never written, never visited, never shown the slightest interest in her nephew's welfare, was suddenly concerned enough to travel halfway across the country to collect them. Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her protective instincts roaring to life with a ferocity that surprised her. "She can't do that," Margaret said, her voice shaking with fury. "She can't just show up after 2 years and take them away from the only home they've ever known." "She's family," Caleb said quietly, but Margaret could see the devastation in his eyes, the way his shoulders had bowed under the weight of another loss he couldn't prevent. "Blood family. And she's married to a doctor, living in a big house in Philadelphia with servants and fancy schools. What judge is going to leave 2 boys with a struggling rancher when they could have all the advantages money can buy?" Tommy had stopped playing and was watching them with the sharp instincts of a child who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of danger. Jake was still throwing sticks for the puppy, blissfully unaware that his world was about to be torn apart again. "When?" Margaret asked, her throat tight. "Next week. She's taking the train as far as Denver, then hiring a carriage for the rest of the journey." Caleb crumpled the telegram in his fist, his knuckles white with barely controlled rage. "She says it's time the boys had proper advantages, that they shouldn't be growing up wild on a ranch with no female influence." "No female influence," Margaret's voice rose dangerously. "What does she think I've been doing here for the past month, playing dress-up?" "You're not their legal guardian, Margaret. Hell, you're not even my wife. In the eyes of the law, you're just the hired help." The words stung more than they should have, cutting deep into wounds Margaret thought had healed. She saw Tommy's face crumple with confusion and fear, saw the exact moment when he understood that the adults were talking about something terrible. "Pa," Tommy's voice was small and scared. "What's happening? Who's coming?" Caleb knelt down in front of his sons, his big hands gentle as he drew them close. Margaret could see him struggling for words that would explain the unexplainable, that would somehow make sense of why the world kept trying to tear their family apart. "Boys, your Aunt Caroline is coming for a visit. She wants to. She thinks it might be good for you to come live with her for a while, in Philadelphia, where there are big schools and—" His voice broke, and Margaret felt her heart shatter at the raw pain in his voice. "No," Tommy shouted, pulling away from his father with violent rejection. "I don't want to go live with some aunt I don't even remember. I want to stay here with you and Miss Margaret. This is our home." Jake had finally understood that something was wrong. His small face had gone white with terror, and his wooden horse was back in his death grip against his chest. "Miss Margaret promised," he whispered. "She promised she wouldn't leave us." Margaret dropped to her knees beside Caleb, pulling both boys into her arms with fierce protectiveness. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "I will never leave you. Do you hear me?" "But what if they make us leave you?" Tommy asked, his voice breaking with the weight of too much loss for someone so young. Margaret looked over the boys' heads at Caleb, seeing her own desperation reflected in his eyes. They were both thinking the same thing, both arriving at the same impossible, necessary conclusion. There was only one way to fight Caroline's claim, only one legal protection that would give them any hope of keeping the boys. "Caleb," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "There is a way, you know there is." He met her eyes across the tangle of frightened children, and she saw the moment when understanding dawned. It wasn't the proposal either of them had dreamed of, wasn't built on declarations of love or romantic speeches under starlit skies. It was built on desperation and determination, and the fierce need to protect two little boys who'd already lost too much. "Margaret," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, "I can't ask you to marry me just to help me keep my sons. That's not fair to you." "You're not asking," Margaret replied firmly. "I'm offering. Those boys are mine now, Caleb. Maybe not by blood, maybe not by law yet, but by choice, by love. I'd rather marry you out of necessity and hope for love to grow than lose them to some stranger who thinks money can replace a mother's heart." Tommy pulled back to look at her, his eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "You'd really marry Pa? You'd really become our ma for real?" "If he'll have me," Margaret said, her gaze locked on Caleb's face. "If he's brave enough to take a chance on us." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the boys' desperate tension as they waited for their father to decide their fate. She thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea, all the ways it could go wrong, all the heartbreak that waited if they failed. But then she thought about Jake's nightmares, about Tommy's fierce protectiveness, about the way Caleb's eyes softened when he watched her braid Leia's hair, and she knew that some things were worth any risk. "Yes," Caleb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Margaret, if you'll have me, if you'll have us, then yes." Tommy let out a whoop of joy that sent the puppy into a frenzy of barking. Jake threw himself into Margaret's arms so hard he nearly knocked her over, his wooden horse forgotten as he buried his face in her neck and held on like she might disappear if he let go. "When?" Margaret asked, practical even in the midst of emotional chaos. "Tomorrow," Caleb said grimly. "We'll ride into town tomorrow and find the preacher. If Caroline arrives to find you're my legal wife and the boy's legal stepmother, she'll have a much harder time making her case." Margaret nodded, her throat too tight for words. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Caleb Morrison, not because he loved her, but because they both loved his children too much to let them go without a fight. It wasn't the fairy tale she dreamed of as a girl, but it was real and necessary, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. As they held the boys close and planned their hasty wedding, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their battle was just beginning. Caroline might be blood family, but she was about to learn that there was more than one way to fight for the people you loved. Margaret Fielding became Margaret Morrison at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, standing in front of Preacher Williams in her best blue dress with wildflowers in her hair and mud on her boots from the hasty ride into town. There was no music, no fancy cake, no congregation of well-wishers, just Caleb in his cleanest shirt, Tommy and Jake as witnesses, and the overwhelming sense that they were racing against time itself. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. Margaret spoke her vows with a steady voice despite the way her hands shook, promising to love and honor a man who was marrying her out of necessity rather than desire. Caleb's voice was rougher, catching slightly on the words that would bind them together in the eyes of God and the law, but his blue eyes never left her face as he pledged his life to hers. When Preacher Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb's kiss was gentle and brief, more gratitude than passion, but it sealed their bargain and made Margaret's heart flutter with dangerous hope. Tommy cheered and Jake clapped his hands, and for one perfect moment, it felt like a real wedding instead of a desperate legal maneuver. They were back at the ranch by sunset, Margaret still wearing her wedding dress because there hadn't been time to pack for an overnight stay in town. She stood in the kitchen that was now legally hers, looking at the simple gold band on her finger and trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just done. She was married. After 32 years of spinsterhood, she was actually married. "Margaret," Caleb said softly from the doorway. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, gratitude and uncertainty and something else that made her pulse skip. "About tonight, about sleeping arrangements, I don't want you to think that I expect." "I know," Margaret said quickly, heat flooding her cheeks. I understand that this marriage is primarily for the boy's benefit. I don't expect anything to change between us just because we've signed some papers." But even as she said the words, Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. Part of her, the foolish, romantic part she thought she'd buried years ago, had hoped that their wedding, hasty as it was, might have changed something fundamental between them. That Caleb might look at her differently now that she was his wife, might see her as more than just a convenient solution to his legal problems. "Right," Caleb said, but his voice sounded strange, almost disappointed. "Of course. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, give you some privacy too." "You'll do no such thing," Margaret interrupted firmly. "This is your house, Caleb. I won't have you sleeping in the barn like some hired hand. I'll take the settee in the parlor." "Margaret, you're my wife now. You shouldn't be sleeping on a settee." The word wife sent a shiver through Margaret that she hoped he couldn't see. "Then we'll figure something else out. But you're not sleeping in the barn on your wedding night, legal arrangement or not." They stared at each other across the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken possibilities and careful boundaries. Margaret found herself remembering the night 3 weeks ago when they'd stood in the hallway talking about bravery and honesty, when she'd thought he might kiss her properly instead of stepping away. The same tension crackled between them now, complicated by the wedding ring on her finger and the legal ties that bound them together. The moment was interrupted by Caroline Morrison's arrival 2 days earlier than expected. They heard the carriage before they saw it, the sound of expensive wheels and well-bred horses cutting through the evening quiet like a knife. Margaret felt her blood turn cold as she watched the elegant vehicle pull up in front of their simple ranch house, its polished surface and brass fittings speaking of wealth and privilege that made their humble home look shabby by comparison. Caroline stepped down from the carriage with the practiced grace of someone who'd never had to worry about mud on her skirts or torn petticoats. She was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 28, with Emma's delicate features refined by expensive clothes and careful grooming. Her traveling dress probably cost more than Margaret made in 6 months of sewing, and her hat was adorned with feathers that had never seen the inside of a chicken coop. Behind her came a man who could only be her husband, tall, thin, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors and the soft hands of someone who'd never done manual labor. Dr. Philip Hartwell looked exactly like what he was, a successful city doctor who viewed the frontier as an unfortunate obstacle between civilized people and their goals. "Caleb," Caroline said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of expensive education and East Coast refinement. "You look rustic." Her gaze swept over the ranch with barely concealed distaste, taking in the weathered buildings, the practical but unglamorous surroundings, and the simple life her nephews had been living. "Caroline," Caleb replied evenly, though Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you until next week. We decided to take an earlier train. Philip has patients to return to, and I wanted to collect the boys and get them settled in their new home as quickly as possible." Caroline's eyes finally landed on Margaret, taking in her wedding dress and the defensive way she stood beside Caleb. "And who is this?" "This is my wife, Margaret," Caleb said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Margaret's heart skip. "We were married this afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing shock and something that might have been fury before she regained control. Dr. Hartwell's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his receding hairline. "Your wife," Caroline's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. How convenient, and how remarkably quick considering that just a month ago your telegram mentioned no such attachment. Things change, Caleb said simply. Indeed they do. Caroline's gaze moved between Caleb and Margaret with calculating intelligence. Tell me, Mrs. Morrison, how long have you known my brother-in-law? Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated by this elegant stranger who thought money gave her the right to tear apart their family. Long enough to know that those boys are loved and cared for here. Long enough to know that a home isn't measured by the size of its bank account. How quaint, Caroline said, her smile sharp as a blade. I'm sure you believe that, but unfortunately, the reality is that children need more than love to thrive. They need education, culture, opportunities for advancement. They need to associate with the right sort of people if they're going to make something of themselves in this world. What they need, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest, is stability. They need to know that the people who care for them won't abandon them when life gets difficult. They need to know they're wanted for who they are, not for what they represent. Caroline's laugh was like ice cracking. My dear woman, you've known these children for what, a few weeks? I'm their blood relative, their late mother's only sister. I have both the legal right and the moral obligation to ensure they receive proper care. And where was that moral obligation when their mother died? The words were out of Margaret's mouth before she could stop them, sharp and unforgiving. Where were you when they were grieving and lost and needed family support? Where were the letters, the visits, the concern for their welfare during the past 2 years? Caroline's face flushed with anger. I was recently married and establishing my own household. I had responsibilities. More important than 2 orphan children. Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. More important than making sure your sister's sons knew they had family who cared about them. Ladies, Dr. Hartwell interrupted smoothly, perhaps we should discuss this matter more rationally. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement that serves everyone's interests. The only arrangement I'm interested in, Caleb said firmly, is the one where my sons stay with their family, right here where they belong. Caroline's smile turned predatory. Your sons, Caleb. How interesting. Because according to the law, illegitimate children have no legal standing, and I believe Emma died in childbirth with your 3rd child, didn't she? A child that didn't survive. The words hit like physical blows. Margaret saw Caleb flinch, saw the old grief and guilt rise in his eyes. Caroline had done her research, had come prepared to attack where it would hurt most. Emma died because the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away, Caleb said quietly, his voice rough with pain. She died because we were too isolated, too far from help when complications arose. Tommy and Jake are my legal sons, born in wedlock and recorded as such. Of course they are, Caroline said sweetly. But the question isn't their legitimacy, it's their welfare. And I think any reasonable judge would agree that 2 young boys would be better served living in a proper home with educational opportunities than growing up wild on a failing ranch. Failing. The word came out sharper than Margaret intended. Caroline's smile widened. Oh yes, my dear, I've done my research. Caleb's been behind on his mortgage payments for months. The bank is already discussing foreclosure. Even if you manage to keep the boys temporarily, how long before you lose the ranch entirely? How long before you're all homeless? Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. She looked at Caleb and saw the truth in his face, the shame, the fear, the knowledge that Caroline had just played her ace. They'd married to protect the boys legally, but they hadn't considered the financial reality that could destroy them all anyway. 6 months. Caroline continued relentlessly. That's how long the bank is giving you before they seize the property. Can you really provide for 2 growing boys when you can barely keep a roof over your own heads? The sound of running footsteps announced Tommy's arrival from the barn, where he'd been tending the animals. He skidded to a stop when he saw the strangers, his eyes immediately finding Margaret and Caleb, with the instinctive fear of a child who'd learned that visitors usually brought bad news. "Pa," Tommy's voice was small and uncertain. "Is everything all right?" Margaret watched Caroline's expression soften as she looked at her nephew for the first time, saw something genuine flicker in her eyes before the calculation returned. This woman might be cold and manipulative, but she wasn't entirely heartless. She genuinely believed she was rescuing the boys from a life of poverty and hardship. "Hello, Tommy," Caroline said gently. "I'm your Aunt Caroline, your mother's sister. I've come to take you and Jake to live with me in Philadelphia, where you'll have everything two growing boys could possibly need." Tommy's face went white with terror. He looked wildly between his father and Margaret, searching for reassurance that this nightmare wasn't real. "I don't want to go to Phil whatever. I want to stay here. This is my home." "Sweetheart," Caroline said, kneeling down to Tommy's level with the careful grace of someone unused to getting her skirts dirty. "I know this is frightening. Change always is. But you'll have your own room and toys and proper schools and—" "I don't want toys," Tommy shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I want my pa and my new ma in my home." The raw pain in his voice broke something in Margaret's chest. She stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding everything else, and pulled Tommy into her arms. Over his head, she met Caroline's eyes with fierce determination. "The boys stay with us," Margaret said quietly. "Whatever it takes, however we have to fight, they stay with their family." Caroline rose slowly, her expression hardening back into aristocratic disdain. "We shall see, Mrs. Morrison, we shall see." The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in the cramped courthouse that served 3 counties, presided over by Judge Matthias Crawford, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his legendary impatience with legal theatrics. Margaret sat beside Caleb in the front row, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while Caroline and Dr. Hartwell occupied the opposite side of the courtroom like generals preparing for war. Tommy and Jake sat between Margaret and Caleb, both boys unusually quiet and pale. Jake hadn't let go of his wooden horse since Caroline's arrival 3 days ago, and Tommy had barely spoken except to ask repeated, whispered questions about whether they'd really have to leave. Margaret's heart ached every time she looked at them, knowing that their fate hung in the balance of legal arguments and adult decisions that would reshape their entire world. Caroline had spent the past 3 days building her case with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to getting her way. She'd visited the bank, spoken with the school teacher, and even interviewed several townspeople about the Morrison family's circumstances. Her lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Denver who charged more per hour than most people earned in a month, had arrived on yesterday's stage with a briefcase full of documents and precedents. Margaret and Caleb had no lawyer. They couldn't afford one, and even if they could, no attorney in 3 counties would have taken a case with such long odds. Caroline had money, social standing, blood ties, and the law on her side. All they had was love, and Margaret was terrifyingly aware that love didn't always win in courtrooms. Judge Crawford entered the courtroom with the heavy tread of a man who'd heard too many sad stories and made too many decisions that changed lives forever. He was older than Margaret had expected, with gray hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen enough of human nature to harbor few illusions about justice or mercy. "This is a custody hearing regarding the minor children Thomas and Jacob Morrison," the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Mrs. Caroline Hartwell is petitioning for custody of her late sister's children, currently in the care of their father, Mr. Caleb Morrison. Mrs. Hartwell, you may present your case." Caroline's lawyer rose with theatrical flourish, his voice smooth and persuasive as he painted a picture of 2 young boys trapped in poverty and isolation, denied the advantages that their aunt's wealth and social position could provide. He spoke of proper education, cultural refinement, and opportunities for advancement that simply didn't exist on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere. "Your Honor," the lawyer concluded, While we don't question Mr. Morrison's affection for his children, affection alone cannot provide what growing boys need to become productive members of society. Mrs. Hartwell offers not only financial security but access to the finest schools, the best medical care, and social connections that will serve these children throughout their lives. Margaret felt each word like a physical blow, watching the judge's expression for any sign of how the arguments were landing. Judge Crawford's face remained carefully neutral, but she caught him glancing at the boys more than once, taking in their clean but patched clothes, their anxious faces, the way they pressed closer to their father with each damning revelation about their circumstances. When it was Caleb's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his broad shoulders set with determination but his voice rough with emotion. "Your Honor, I won't pretend we have money. I won't pretend this ranch is as prosperous as it once was, or that I can give my boys everything that wealth might provide. But I can give them something Mrs. Hartwell can't, the knowledge that they're loved for who they are, not what they represent." Caleb's voice grew stronger as he continued, his love for his sons evident in every word. "Tommy is brave and protective, always looking out for his little brother even when he's scared himself. Jake is gentle and thoughtful, with a way with animals that amazes everyone who sees it. These aren't just children to be molded into proper gentlemen. They're individuals with their own gifts and dreams and fears. They've already lost their mother. I won't let them lose their home too." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes as she watched Caleb fight for his children with nothing but raw honesty and paternal love. But she could see the judge weighing practical concerns against emotional appeals, and she knew that heartfelt words might not be enough to overcome Caroline's overwhelming advantages. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Crawford said, turning his attention to Margaret, "you've recently married into this family. What is your perspective on this matter?" Margaret rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware that this might be their last chance to change the judge's mind. She looked at Caroline's confident expression, at the lawyer's satisfied smile, at Tommy's frightened face and Jake's silent tears, and felt something fierce and unbreakable crystallize in her chest. "Your Honor," Mrs. Hartwell spoke about the boys' welfare, about providing them with advantages and opportunities. But she's never asked what the boys themselves want. She's never asked Tommy about his dreams of running the ranch someday, or listened to Jake explain why he carved a special stall for the orphaned foal he's been nursing back to health. She sees two children who need rescuing from poverty, but I see two boys who have already built a life worth fighting for." Margaret's voice grew stronger, powered by months of love and determination. "Mrs. Hartwell can offer them money and social position, but can she offer them the security of knowing they're wanted? She disappeared from their lives when their mother died and only returned when it became convenient. What happens the next time her priorities change? What happens when these boys become inconvenient instead of charity projects?" "Your Honor," Caroline's lawyer interrupted, but Judge Crawford held up a hand for silence. "Let her finish." Margaret took a deep breath, knowing this was her moment to fight for everything that mattered. 3 months ago, I was a lonely spinster who thought life had passed me by. These boys changed everything. They chose me as their mother before any adult had the sense to see what we could become together. They taught me that family isn't about blood or money or social position. It's about showing up every day, about keeping promises, about loving someone enough to fight for them when the world tries to tear you apart. She looked directly at Caroline, her voice steady with conviction. "Mrs. Hartwell, you say you want what's best for Tommy and Jake. Then listen to them. Really listen. Ask them where they want to live, who they want to call family, what kind of life would make them happy. Because I promise you the answer won't be found in your bank account." The courtroom fell silent except for the soft sound of Jake's sniffles. Margaret sat down, her heart pounding, knowing she'd said everything she could say. Now it was up to Judge Crawford to decide whether love and determination were worth more than money and social status. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said quietly, "you mentioned financial difficulties. How do you plan to address the foreclosure proceedings?" Caleb's shoulders sagged slightly. "We're working on it, Your Honor. Margaret and I will find a way. We have to." Judge Crawford nodded slowly, then turned his attention to the boys. "Tommy, Jake, come here." The boys looked questioningly at their father, who nodded encouragement. They approached the judge's bench with obvious reluctance, Tommy holding Jake's hand and both of them staying close together. "Boys," Judge Crawford said gently, his voice softer than it had been all morning, "this is your chance to tell me what you want. No one will be angry with you, no matter what you say. Where do you want to live?" Tommy straightened his shoulders with the determined bravery of someone far older than his years. "We want to stay home, sir, with Pa and Ma Margaret. Please don't make us go away." "And why is that, son?" "Because they love us," Tommy said simply, "and because we love them back, and because home isn't about how big your house is or how much money you have. It's about belonging somewhere." Judge Crawford looked at Jake, who hadn't spoken. "What about you, Jake? Do you have anything you want to tell me?" Jake nodded solemnly and reached into his pocket, pulling out his wooden horse. With careful reverence, he placed it on the judge's desk. "This was Mama's," he whispered. "She gave it to me before she went to heaven. But I want to give it to you because maybe if you have something that belonged to Mama, you'll understand that we can't leave her behind. She's buried here in the ground by the big oak tree. If we go away, who'll bring her flowers?" The courtroom was absolutely silent. Margaret saw tears in the judge's eyes, saw Caroline's carefully composed expression crack with genuine emotion. Even the sharp-faced lawyer from Denver looked uncomfortable, as if he'd suddenly realized they were talking about real children with real hearts, instead of legal assets to be distributed. Judge Crawford picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his hands with infinite gentleness. "Jake, this belongs to you. Your mama gave it to you because she wanted you to have something to remember her by, but I understand what you're trying to tell me." He handed the horse back to Jake, then looked out over the courtroom with the weight of Solomon making an impossible decision. "Mrs. Hartwell, your intentions are admirable, and your ability to provide material advantages is undeniable. But these children have made their wishes clear, and they have a legal father who loves them and a stepmother who's proven her commitment to their welfare." Margaret's heart leaped with desperate hope, but she could see the "but" coming in the judge's expression. "However, the financial situation cannot be ignored. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to give you 6 months to resolve the foreclosure issue. If at the end of that time you've managed to save the ranch and demonstrate financial stability, custody will remain with you. If not, I'll have no choice but to award custody to Mrs. Hartwell, as she can provide security that you cannot." "Your Honor," Caroline's lawyer began, but Judge Crawford cut him off. "My decision is final. Court dismissed." As the courtroom erupted in confused conversations and legal arguments, Margaret pulled both boys into her arms, holding them close while Caleb wrapped his strong arms around all three of them. They'd won a reprieve, but the war was far from over. 6 months to save the ranch, to prove they could provide the security the boys needed, to fight for the right to call themselves a family. "We'll find a way," Margaret whispered against Tommy's hair, feeling Jake's small hand slip into hers. "Whatever it takes, we'll find a way." Caroline approached them as they prepared to leave, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Morrison," she said quietly, "I hope you understand that I genuinely believed I was doing what was best for the boys." Margaret met her eyes steadily. "I believe you did, but sometimes what's best isn't what's easiest or most comfortable. Sometimes it's about having faith that love can overcome obstacles that money can't solve." Caroline nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her eyes. 6 months, Mrs. Morrison. I hope for the boys' sake that you can make it work." As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, Tommy's hand in Margaret's and Jake riding on Caleb's shoulders, Margaret felt the weight of the challenge ahead. 6 months to save everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, everything that mattered. but as she looked at her husband and her sons, because that's what they were now, legally and in every way that counted, Margaret felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just hope, but certainty. They were a family worth fighting for, and she'd move mountains if necessary to protect what they'd found together. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility, built on the unshakable foundation of a love that had chosen them all when they needed it most. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Morrison knew exactly where she belonged.